Today we are going to be multiplying and dividing real numbers. We talked about yesterday what real numbers were. They were rational numbers or irrational numbers. Rational numbers were numbers that we could write as a fraction. Irrational ones were ones we could not. Well, here are a few more terms that I want to go over. And one is reciprocal. It's not spelled right there. It's missing a C, so I'll go ahead and respell it for you. It's R-E-C-I-P-R-O-C-A-L. Reciprocal. And reciprocal are two numbers whose product is 1. So for instance, if we had 3 times by what number would give us 1? Well, the two numbers that multiply are the reciprocals of one another, and that would be 1/3. And you'll see it a little bit easier if I write 3 as a fraction. So you see, 3 could be written as 3 over 1. Times 1 over 3, the 3's cross cancel, leaving us with 1. So if I look at the number 3/5, 3/5, what times 3/5 makes 1? Well, I need 3's to cross cancel, so that means I need a 3 on the bottom. I need the 5's to cross cancel to make 1, so that would be a 5 on top, so it would be 5/3. So 3/5 and 5/3 are reciprocals. And so if you just turn the fraction upside down, you've got yourself a reciprocal. Now, real quick, just looking at a negative number, if I had the negative 2/3, the reciprocal of that is the same sign because we want it to equal 1. And multiplying two negatives together, it's a rule we're going to talk about, always gives us a positive. So you see how the 3's cancel, 2's cancel, negatives cancel as well. Well, the inverse property of multiplication uses the reciprocal. And so it says the product of a number and its reciprocal. So let's see what happens. So if I take a number like 1/2, I multiply it by 2 by its reciprocal, that'll give me 1. So that's what the inverse property of multiplication is. We use it when we are trying to deal with some fractions. If I want it to cancel two numbers out and make 1, that's when I use that. And properties of 0. Well, whenever you're multiplying a number by 0, it equals 0. We'll see that in action. So if you take 3, times it by 0, you're going to get 0. If you take negative 2, you times it by 0, you're going to end up with 0. And so you could even put 0 first. 0 times by 1 is going to end up being 0. Well, let's take a look at some rules. We talked about a rule just a moment ago with multiplication, and it works with division as well. And the rule is this: if you have two negatives, let's say a negative times by a negative, two negatives, that's going to give us a positive. It works the same with division. If it was a negative divided by a negative number, that's also going to give us a positive. So if it's the same sign, two of the same signs, you're going to end up with a positive number. Two positives multiply to make a positive. Two positives divide to equal a positive. But if you have just one negative, so a negative times by a positive, that's going to give you a negative. Same thing if you have the opposite, like a positive first and a negative second, that's going to also be a negative. The same thing with division. So it doesn't matter where that negative sign is, if it's just one of them, it's always going to be a negative. So those are the rules that we have to remember. A little different than addition. So let's take a look at some of these problems. 7 and 2/10 divided by 8. So if we want to do this, notice we're dividing by 8. So it's the same thing as saying this: 8 into 7 and 2/10. And so when I do this division, I notice that the sign, I've got one negative sign here, one positive sign here, so I know my answer is going to be negative. So I can already put that in my answer box. I just got to figure out what the number is. So I see 8 doesn't go into 7, but it does go into 72 9 times. Notice that the decimal point is going to come straight up. And so my answer is negative 0 and 9/10. That is it. So here's a multiplication problem. The dot stands for multiply. So if I just put the 3 down below here and multiply it like this in this column format, you can see what the number is going to be. Notice first, let's figure out the sign. Negative times by a positive. This time we have the negative sign first, but since there's only one of them, odd number of negatives makes a negative. And that's a rule you might want to remember. Odd number of negatives equals a negative. And if it was an even number of negatives, it equals a positive. So even number of
Josh Taylor, if you're on campus, can you please call 228? Josh Taylor, 228.
Negatives equals a positive. So if you have an even number of negatives, it's a positive. Odd number of negatives, it is a negative. Let's take a look at this. Finish this problem up. 3 times 4 is 12. And multiplying the 3 and the 5, that's 15, and 1 makes 16. Now I've got to move that decimal over. How many spaces? Well, there's 2 spaces after the decimal. So we're just going to move it over 1, 2. So that makes 1 and 62 hundredths. And we know it's negative because there's only one negative, an odd number of negatives. Well, taking a look at our next one, notice that we are dividing this time by a decimal. So there's a rule that goes along with it. But before we do that, let's figure out what kind of sign we're going to end up with here. So we're having 2 negatives, dividing a negative into a negative. So I know it's going to end up being a positive number. So let's see what it is. Well, when I have to divide by a decimal, I move the decimal over 1, 2 spaces. So I'm going to do the same thing here. If I move it over in the dividend, I got to do the same thing with, if I move it over in the divisor, I got to move it over in the dividend as well. So I'll move it here. It's 9.00. That's what it was initially, but now since I moved it over 2 spaces, it's like multiplying by 100. So I got to move this over 2 spaces, like multiplying by 100. So really, I'm doing 3 into 900. So let's go ahead and rewrite that. And the decimal goes at the end. So 3 goes into 9 3 times. 3 goes evenly, and 3 goes into 0 0 times. So 300 was the answer, is the answer. Moving on to our next one, we've got a division problem. Now it's a division of fractions. Notice what we're going to do here. So I'm going to rewrite this as a multiplication problem. That's the rule that we learned before. So we take the reciprocal. Notice I took the reciprocal of the second fraction. So when I go ahead and do some division, these 5s end up canceling, leaving me with 7. No need to worry about the sign here. They're both positive, so the answer is positive. Here we have 1 negative, so let's go ahead and write our negative sign in there. I know it's negative, but before we do any multiplication, we need to change it to a multiplication problem. That means we need to take the reciprocal of the second fraction, not the first, but the second. Don't see any cross-canceling here, so I go ahead and multiply across, so I get negative 12 over 35, and that is our answer right there. Looking at our next one, again, you keep the first fraction the same, multiply by the reciprocal. Notice how we have 2 negatives, so I know it's going to be a positive number. So I look for cross-canceling, see a little bit there, and I get 2 as the answer. Next one here is negative 16 over 25. I'm multiplying by the reciprocal once more. So it's still a negative number. Reciprocally, the sign stays the same, just the numbers switch location in the fraction. And we go ahead and do some division. So I see 5 goes into the 25 5 times. 4 goes into the 16 4 times. Multiply across, we've got ourselves 4/5. Well, taking a look at our next problem here, you're dividing by 0 or multiplying by 0 in some cases. Now, we can't divide by 0. Now, I'll show you why. See, if I did 0 into 7, I would never get myself anywhere because 0 times a number just makes 0. So if I put any number here, I could put 3 here, but that would still equal 0, and I'd have 7 left over. Or I could have, let's go ahead and erase that real quick, I could have put 2 here, and I would get the same exact result. Times by 0 equals 0, and I'd have 7 left over. Or I could have put a different number. We could have put negative 1, and I'd get the same exact result. So you can't divide by 0 because you don't get anywhere, first of all, and there's a million different ways or an infinite number of numbers you could put on top. So what we say is this is undefined. You can't do the division. So since we can't do the division, we just say undefined. Not no solution, but just undefined. So the next one, here we have 0 divided by negative 5. Well, now we can do this. Now watch, the reason is that when I set it up, notice the denominator is the number that goes outside the box here, like the top dog goes in the doghouse, 0 in the doghouse here. Negative 5 times by 0 does make 0. You see, we did the division. See, we got 0 as the remainder here, as the number that we got when we did the subtraction. So that is the answer. So 0 is what you get when you divide a number into 0. Same thing when you multiply by 0, you always get 0. But you can't do this. Notice again, we'll try it again. See, the top dog goes in the doghouse. And I could put any number up here. Any number. Any number is going to give me, doesn't matter what it is always going to give me 0, which will still give me 53. And I can't do anything with this. So this is undefined. So undefined is what it is when you're dividing by 0. One more problem here. 7 million people saw off-Broadway shows at an average price of $30 per show. So 7 million people. Go ahead and write that number out. And we have $30 per show. So I'm going to multiply by $30 per show. So whenever you see a rate, this is a rate, dollars per, the per means a fraction bar right there, per show. So we want to find out how much was spent on tickets for off-Broadway shows. So that's what we're going to find out here. So we're going to go ahead and multiply these, because there's 7 million people saw these shows. So notice that the shows, so 7 million shows pretty much were seen here. And these shows will end up cross-canceling. So all you have to do is multiply. Now when I do this, watch. I do 3 times 7 is 21. And then I just count up how many zeros I have. I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 zeros. So that's what I'm going to put down here. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Then I can put my commas in. And there it is. 210 million is the amount of money that was made off that. So those are types of problems you're going to end up seeing on tonight's homework. Good luck.